Welcome back, fellow armchair generals. This is Gamer 1745 here with my continuing playthrough of Hearts of Iron 3's Black Ice 10.41. Now, just at the end of the last episode, we were sort of looking at this here. If this was the historical conditions of Japan at the time, meaning the war proper is over in China. Now, Japan did directly control, the Koreans didn't have equal citizenship to the Japanese or anything like that, but nothing like that. They were a subject people, but it was sort of directly ruled by Japan, where Manchukuo and the Republic of China, Nanjing, reorganized, or however you want to talk about it, which its capital was here. Those were puppets. Meijing, however, I don't know. It was sort of a puppet Mongolian state. They even thought about setting up a sort of southern Chinese puppet state. I don't really think Japan... Wow, that's a noisy truck. Wanted to, have Lebensraum and start directly ruling large chunks of China. Okay, let's talk about some awkward truths for a moment here. And this is going to get into some modern politics as well, and modern comments. Recently on Twitter, some people were talking about how to, and I won't go, and two sort of fairly old, famous character actors from, the golden age of Hollywood, back in the 30s and 40s. Well, in the 30s and 40s, were racists. Like one supposedly refused to sit at a table with a black person, for some Hollywood thing or whatever. And I don't know all of their views, but yeah, they had racist views. I don't know that they hated black people or anything like that, but I don't think they thought they were equal people. And so people, oh yeah, well, these actors, we love them, but how do you separate out? And I'm going, on this stuff. They were men of their times, okay? You have to understand, people back then, and there were a lot of racist types. Now, we have a lot of racist types today. Most of them, quite honestly, are in the Democratic Party. They don't hate black people or whatever. They think they're inferior and they want to help them. That's why they do all this special stuff for them. They won't say it, but they actually believe they are inferior. You can see it, what was it, Biden's comment not so long ago? Poor kids are just as good as white kids or something like that, he said. I'm paraphrasing. I know I'm getting it wrong. In some comment, this is within the last year or so. They look at minorities as cases to be helped. It's not the racism of hate the other people. It's sort of racism of pity and whatnot. Would Japanese prefer a copy of the UK Commonwealth system? Something sort of like that, Ragar. But back then, back in the 30s and 40s, Japanese were very racist. I mean, very racist. They, now I know, I'm sure you can find examples of them not being so, but they were very racist. They thought themselves very superior. I don't know how they viewed themselves. I'm trying to remember if specifically like referring to Aryans or whatever, but they thought themselves at least the most superior Asian race, and up there in the top of the races on the planet. And there was a lot of propaganda leading up to and during World War II about Japanese racism. And they didn't even need to mention things like Africans. They were referring to other Asian groups. And it was very genetic. Well, okay. Now I want to say today, in modern day world, they're still racist, okay? Understand this. Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, Thais, Indians, Africans, Latin Americans, they're all racist people. Europeans, they're racists to this day, a great majority. I know back in this time, Josephine Baker, who was, of course, subject, a famous star and entertainer, Black American, subject to, racism in America, and including legal type racism, no blacks allowed to stay in this hotel where she's been booked to perform or something like that, in their event hall. So she faced racism in America, and she goes to France, and they're not so racist. I mean, I'm not sure she wasn't entirely thinking that there's no racism in France, but no, I can go to any hotel. I'm respected anywhere. I can do, go wherever I want to. And people, treat me with reasonable respect. And there's none of this. Yeah. Jazz musicians, Black entertainers, Black wealthy businessmen that can travel to France in the 1930s. They could probably stay at any hotel. What do you think the reaction from somebody with modern day Ivory Coast in the Côte d'Ivoire or whatever? One of them were some sailor, Ivory Coast Black African type guy who, has become a sailor kind of thing, speaks broken French. What do you think his reaction is, or what reaction to him is going to be if he shows up in France? Or how did the French treat their colonial subjects directly in their home habitats? Okay, see, there it's going to be even worse than the normal racism in America. I'm not talking about the Ku Klux Klan and their evil actions. This is not that. I'm just talking about the average citizen back then who thought white people were better. Not that black people didn't deserve rights or whatever, but they just thought white people were better than other people. Again, I want to say I'm against racism. I don't believe large groups of people, race is any significant factor in how different groups. I believe it's culture. It's culture, it's culture, it's culture. It's not your skin color or your eye color. It's culture, culture, culture. I believe European-based culture is an excellent, one of the best type cultures, and the Anglo versions of it is better than the average European versions of culture. That's better than German, better than French, better than Spanish culture. I believe the Anglo culture is better. And part of that is, in my view, is successful cultures. We can talk about Chinese culture, we can talk about Japanese cultures. They're rather successful cultures too. I just still like my culture better, and I can understand why a Frenchman or a Pole or an Italian will like their culture best. I'm not saying they. Thank you for following very much, and again, everybody, if you haven't already, you can follow on Twitch and subscribe on YouTube. And if you are on Twitch right now, you can scroll down and see the link to the YouTube channel. I'm live on both, but see the videos later. I can understand why people like their culture better than other cultures. I like my culture. I also like other cultures, some other cultures too. But partly what I look at is success and failure rates of culture. And a good one, and talked a little bit about with like recently online, a friend, an Angolan friend. But we can see here today, right now, today, not back then, this part of Africa is called Somaliland, and there's a country that basically no other country officially recognizes. They recognize Somalia and are owning this. But Somaliland, most people, including Europeans and what else, can go walk around one of their towns and be relatively safe. Even though it is an Islamic-based culture, you're not going to be attacked by a terrorist. You're not going to be, I'm not saying there isn't thievery. I'm not saying somebody desperate won't come out with a knife or a gun or something. I'm not saying it's like, as safe as, a gated Beverly Hills community to walk around in, but it's relatively, thank you, Niagara. It's not maybe 100% safe, but from everything I get from there, I would feel relatively comfortable. I'd be on my guard, but relatively comfortable walking around any major town or city in Somaliland. I would not feel comfortable walking around in Mogadishu right now, and most of the rest of Somalia, including another sort of breakaway area, Puntland up here, Puntland. And this is where most of the pirates, the Somali pirates, come from, is Puntland up there. Now, what are the differences between these two groups? Well, to my understanding, I know this has gotten into full lecture mode and we'll get back to things. These are genetically roughly the same group of people. And culturally, historically, they're roughly the same cultural group of people. I think they speak the same language. Again, I'm not an expert on these, so that's why I notice I'm saying I think, but they're basically the same. Roberto did say that this is a bigger country to govern, and that's a smaller country, and that does have an effect. Yes, it does. But this is a failed state. This is now a working state. Africa, the what is it? The OAU Organization, Africa Union, or whatever it's called. I think they use the French sort of setup. They, long through the Cold War, would never recognize under any circumstances a breakaway country, because all of the nations that were members of them were worried about breakaway elements in their country and recognizing this. Is why Biafra, one of the reasons why Biafra failed. Oh, so certain localized other countries would sort of maybe want to recognize a breakaway region, but the group would have to vote on recognizing another African nation as being an independent sovereign nation, and they'd never get a majority vote. And that's also why they didn't recognize Katanga, breaking up the Congo. They just never did. Once the borders were set, once Zambian borders were set, it's Zambia. They can't expand or contract. Tanzania can invade Uganda to get rid of Idi Amin, but they can't grab any territory. Wouldn't recognize territory changes. So only after the Cold War, and I can think of only two cases where they've recognized breakaway states now. One being South Sudan, the other being Eritrea. So it is very hard to get nations to recognize breakaway nations. So Somaliland was the British colony here. Somalia was the Italian colony here. So I believe the primary difference between these two groups is this was a colony of Britain and this was a colony of Italy, and not just, say, a language different. Hey, Kevin, very local tribe. Yeah, well, you can get down into micro-state kind of things, but you can see the sort of sub-Saharan African, if you will, versus the sort of Afro God, I'm on something like this. I'm getting dangerous into areas I don't know, but sort of the Afro Arabic genetic mix or something you might see. You can see skin, not just skin color changes, but also a bone structure changes. And I'm not a geneticist and I don't know, but also sort of an animist culture. And somewhat Christianized down here, where Muslim up here. Yeah, but in these, you look at Sudan. Hell, Sudan is like what, twice the size of, in actuality is like twice the size of France, if it was this whole state. So yeah, breaking them up, not into micro or very local tribal governments, but into regional governances, and some of them are of very different ethnic languages and origins, even though they may be all sub-Saharan African. And again, I'm out of my depths in some of this, but so you see basically the same two groups. Now, I'm not just saying because one colonist group spoke Italian and ate spaghetti, and the other one spoke English and drank tea or something like that is what makes these difference. I mean, it's also in how they were governed, how they were colonized, if you will. And I don't know all the details of either two specific examples here, but let's jump over to like Kenya. There was an actual hard push by Britain to settle British people in Kenya. Similarly, like in Rhodesia, even in northern Rhodesia, but particularly in southern Rhodesia, an attempt to settle, Britons in Rhodesia to permanently live there, as opposed to a lot of cases in Africa where you were coming in, you were going to make your money, work there for 5, 10, 20 years, and then come back to France or come back to Portugal or come back to wherever. It wasn't trying to settle large groups of people. I don't really think there was a significant attempt to settle Britons at all in Somaliland. I think it was more of a, hey, this is a convenient place, we just sort of need to control it. But it's just how they governed here, how they included locals into the local governing structure is different. I don't know the details versus different than Italy. Okay, so this is why, so their culture, I don't even want to say original culture, because these have been peoples have migrated and changed and fought over this for generations. Hell, there was a Roman brief for 10 or 20 years or something, a Roman outpost here on Socotra. So cultural influences vary and come over, but the pre-European, shall we say, cultural influences here were basically the same. Thank you for trying to make your mufflers sound very loud. So it's the same base culture, both influenced by two different European cultures. One is more successful than the other, and neither of them have like lots of natural resources that the other doesn't, or whatever you might be able to point to in other cases. The difference between, say, Yemen, that's sort of joined now, and Saudi Arabia. Yemen doesn't have any oil. Saudi Arabia has lots of oil. Things like that can be why things happen differently. Okay, so this is just sort of explaining my culturalist viewpoint as I look at this. I don't believe large groups of people, individuals are individuals. I don't believe large groups of people, any sort of significant determination of what's going on is based on race. But most of the people on the planet today believe so. Racism is less in European-based nations. And I say that because I'm including the, not just British, but other European continued possessions around the world globally, is less than it is in other places. Chinese and Japanese are rather racist today, and it's not that they hate other races. It's often they just look down on other races. Japan, like I say, during this time period was virulently racist. And so it has a racial identity, um, as well as a cultural identity. It has both. And there's definitely cases of Japanese bringing sort of Chinese and half Chinese, half Japanese, half Chinese sort of into their system on equal basis, maybe not quite the right term, but as sort of literally sort of adopted and stepchildren sort of basis in some cases. But they were highly racist back then. I'm not saying they're that way today, but they are racist today. And it's not that they, in my knowledge, the best that I know, that they hate any particular race on the planet. They're not like that. They're not like wanting to be Nazis. They just think, they look at Africa and they think blacks are inferior. And that's just the way they look, and Chinese and others. That's just sort of at the core of their culture, is that they are still racist. They're not wanting to put on hoods or go harm other people nowadays, but back then they did. So I don't think, and this all gets into this, for the game purposes, Japan is annexing this territory. But in actual fact, I don't think that Japan was interested, desiring to annex the territory at all. They really liked, and what they really wanted to do is what we see here in Manchukuo. Japan buys into the idea very heavily of empire, and that empires are the things that are independent and govern themselves. And so either you're an empire or you're not. And if you're not, you are sort of a subject of empires. You're at the whim of empires. And it sees, which it is, America as an empire. We are an empire in the United States. We are 50 states and a few territories. I'm not talking about imperial ambitions of necessarily, I know we go do peacekeeping and interventions in other parts of the world. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about the sort of, the 50 states and Puerto Rico and, a few islands, Guam and whatever. We're a big empire. We still are. We don't like to call ourselves that. We don't like to think of ourselves as that term. But yeah, just try to have one of these states think about wanting to go independent, and you'll start having the government very seriously, including going to killing people, trying to stop you from being independent. There is no mechanism for a state to leave the Union after the Civil War. And so, there was definitely, not so much because Trump was seen as a temporary thing, but under some of the Bush presidencies, Vermont or whatever wants to leave the United States because it hates what Bush and whatever is doing. It's not necessarily a right or left wing thing. There's been reasons that significant elements within particular states have decided that they would prefer to be just an independent state. The United States is an empire. It isn't going to let that happen. Japan sees the world in these terms because it looks at the British Empire, the French Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, because you got to understand Japan is forming itself when these other entities exist. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire. They look around and they see these empires. Yeah, they see South America, but they see it's sort of pathetic countries down there in South America. And they're pathetic because they're not part of an empire, either locally or on the grand scheme of things. And it sees dying empires because it's, it watches the last of the real Spanish Empire fall apart with the Spanish-American War. Cuba goes independent. The Philippines become a claimed to be, and it was, but the Japanese are very unsure about this, temporary possession of the Philippines. Now, Guam was meant to be a permanent, and still is, possession of the United States, and generally speaking, Guam really is happy to be part of the United States. It knows it's not big enough to be a territory, but it does not want to be independent. Because it looks around and sees, yeah, we're sort of in a sea of, even today, of different influences and whatnot. But yeah, and so it sees empires, and it thinks it needs to have an empire. To protect itself, it sees that it needs industry to be and industrialized countries are countries that are significant on the world stage and are not, either puppets or, being a willow, bending with the winds, like it might see some other thing. Oh, and it sees even mention Arno here, the Dutch Empire still existed, and it may be a waning empire in its eyes, like Spain was, but it sees empires, and it needs industry. Well, it has some coal, but it doesn't have enough coal. It has nowhere near enough steel, and coal is a good energy source, but it doesn't have enough, and it doesn't have enough oil, and liquefaction of oil or of coal into oil is not, at least at the start of all of this, not really much of a thing. Yeah, I know they are paying attention. Not necessarily they're following along, but they are paying attention to Germany's attempts at creating artificial oil, or however you want to say it, liquefying coal. So it feels it needs these resources, and it likes what it does in Manchukuo. It knows, and it actually revels in its bloodiness. There is still the samurai culture of killing for killing's sake going on. Not just warriors fighting each other, but just killing people. At this time, again, we're talking, the 1930s and 40s. And so it likes that as a nation, as an organization. It likes what it's doing in Manchukuo. It sees that during Japanese occupation of Manchukuo, that Japan is significantly, massively improving its infrastructure. Now, of course, it is doing so, but it is also doing so to move resources out of Manchukuo. But it is doing that. And it is building a lot of modern institutions, both physically building, meaning building the buildings themselves, and also organizations that are modern, not necessarily Western, but modern in Manchukuo. So even though it's maybe killing off large batches of the population, it's trying to build a nice new hospital there and get doctors there. And that was the only reason it's killing off large groups of people in Manchukuo is because, well, some are just literally bandits, and whatnot that's traditionally been going on there for long before the Japanese ever show up. But just also people that resist the new order. I mean, so it's either you're on board or you're dead, if you get it. Well, cool. Niagara, have some tacos. Have fun with your girlfriend. So they like what they're doing there. There is an attempt to get because there is in Japan population pressures. There is an attempt to create some Japanese settlements in Manchukuo. But relatively speaking to Japan, and relatively speaking to sort of at least this area of China at the time, Manchukuo is underpopulated. It's sort of something of a wilderness in many areas. But there really isn't a huge move that I can detect that is going to sort of be like what they're doing with Germany's doing with the general government, meaning it was set up as a puppet state. Again, Hitler is trying to erase the idea of Poland. So they don't even call it the general government of Poland. It's just the general government. Everybody understands what it is the general government of, but they are erasing Poland with the mind to eventually annex the territory to Germany. What was going to happen to the Poles? Wasn't going to be good. Whatever the final result was going to be for them, they might end up over here or over here, and then generations over here, and they might be over the generations migratorily moving eastward or something. But whatever was going to happen with the Poles, or just sort of what poles? What are poles? We have poles. They're stacked over there. You see, you need some poles. We got poles for you. We can pull them out and stick them. What are you doing? Putting up a tent? Yeah. Whatever the final solution of poles would have been, it wasn't going to be good for the poles. And it has quite a bit different weather when compared to Japan. Japanese could move with their own lifestyles to Korea and. Well, yes and no. The Dutch East Indies DIE is. I know what he's talking about there. That looks like Japan to me. I'm not saying it's just the same, but it's not terribly different than here. Japan is not a tropical country. It is not. Even in the south, it isn't, in my opinion. I haven't been to Japan. But took 3 years of Japanese language and sort of has off and on studied it for a long time. Japan is not tropical. Coming down to here is going to be a shock to Japanese way of life in the tropics. It really is. In America, and which I think is transmitted its views of World War II, really sort of talks about the Japanese as great jungle fighters and whatnot. I don't think they were. I'm not saying they were bad jungle fighters. I just think they were good fighters that happened to be fighting in the jungle, fighting the Americans, and because Japan had such poor military industrialization, they don't have big tanks. So their light tanks do well in the jungle, or their light artillery does well in the jungle because it's light, not because they're great jungle fighters. It's just they don't have a lot of big guns to move around. I mean, obviously they have big guns, but not many. And they're mostly, put on ships and things. But, Korea, and I think Taiwan was, or Formosa, however you want to say it back then, there's definitely more preferred immigration policy, most assuredly. But so what they want to do, I think, my understanding, and you could talk to different people at a particular, different leadership elements within Japan and get different answers, even if they're speaking honestly, get different answers to the same question. There were several fascist parties sort of attempted that failed, and it really wasn't until after Tojo becomes head of Prime Minister of Japan that there's, and I'm forgetting what the party they called them, really starts to really somewhat, even then it's not really fascism. It's a different version of state capitalism. It isn't fascism, really. But they sort of absorbed the last of the sort of fascist party into it, as opposed, ideologically fascist. So, it depends on sort of depends on who you are in Japan, because you got to remember Hokkaido up here is rather cold and snowy. Japanese were not great jungle fighters. They were just often more willing to fight in the jungle than their opponents. Absolutely, IKP. That's a good way of putting it. And unlike other opponents that the United States have faced at different times, including like Spain in the Spanish-American War, the Japanese were willing to fight. And not just, if we're winning, we're doing great. If we're losing, we're running away, kind of thing. No, they were willing to fight. And again, like the Philippines, they fight the Spanish. It's mostly sort of a naval battle here in Manila Bay. Should have a bigger bay in here, but yeah. And the Spanish basically give up once that's done because the Spanish aren't stupid. They don't need to fight a losing battle. But then they have to, mostly down in the south, but they have to fight different guerrilla movements. And the guerrilla movements are, yeah, doing sort of smart guerrilla things. And hey, if we're winning the ambush, we're fighting it. If we're losing, we're running back into the jungle, or whatever. No, the Japanese were willing to stay and fight, even when the odds were against them. Not that they would retreat, especially if, see, the sort of death or glory type Japanese elements is mostly because they had nowhere to go. When you're invading a little island here, and these islands are depicted way too huge for just so that we can click on them and see them, but they would, retreat and do, force marches to the jungle to get out. They were, and towards the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, they were trying to evacuate as many Japanese as they could. They were willing to retreat. It's just when they couldn't retreat, they would then, sort of do what the Americans should have done a few times, like at Wake. They should have just kept fighting because they ended up all being killed anyways. After they surrendered, they all got killed. And had they kept fighting, they probably would have won the initial invasion because the Japanese were losing. And just the different bunker positions were no longer communicating with each other, and so they didn't, I haven't, the radio, not radio, the telephone lines that were, field telephone lines that were wired between the bunkers have been cut by the artillery, and so they had no idea if there was anybody alive in the bunker, 200 yards away from them or whatever it was, and they ended up surrendering, and yeah, that was a mistake. Should have just fought to the end. But yeah, it was sort of that kind of thing. And there was huge amounts of Japanese propaganda at how bad the Americans were going to treat their prisoners. And that's why you see civilians jumping off the cliff in Okinawa and whatnot, because they were told that the Americans were literally going to eat them. Americans don't eat people. Americans have better food. They're not going to eat people. It was literally propaganda like that, and that the Japanese government was pumping out. And I remember seeing, it was a few years ago, but in the more recent Afghan stuff, it was either Afghan or the tribal areas of Pakistan. There was some Afghani, villager was being interviewed or talking about, the Americans are coming over here. They want to take our women. We got to protect our women from the Americans. They want to take our women. Have you seen our women? Do you think the Americans are interested in Afghan women? Yeah, I'm sure there's a few beautiful Afghan women out there. Yeah, but really, you really think we're coming to Afghanistan to take your women? Really, people? And somebody's probably told you that to get you upset with us, because they do sort of, different tribes raid each other still to this day and kidnap people and whatnot. Yeah. No, we're not interested in Afghan women. The Americans there. We may be, if you have oil, we may be interested in your oil or something. Now, under Trump, we had plenty of oil, but now that we're under Biden, we're having to import oil again because he shut down a bunch of stuff. So, Democrats, we're going to invade you for your oil. Republicans, we want our own oil. But yeah, so yeah, no, the Japanese did horrendous anti-American propaganda that made the Japanese soldier, made the Japanese civilian think that surrender to the Americans was going to be some horrendously bad thing, and not just be defeated and be taken prisoners of war. And yes, there was a lot of shame for the Japanese soldier to be taken as a prisoner of war, and what would his reception be had he ever returned home. There is definite that type of stuff going on, but you definitely there are rare examples of Japanese being taken prisoners by the Chinese. Definitely a few more examples of, in the early Khalkhin Gol, which is out here, battles, but there were a few others along the area. The Russians, the Soviets, whatever, taking Japanese prisoners, and some prisoner exchanges and whatnot. But Yeah, it's not quite the hardcore situation. And in China and things, if things were going bad, Japanese units would withdraw. I mean, it's not like, oh yeah, we're never defeated. No, they'd fight their way out, and they also knew that the Chinese mostly weren't going to treat them well if they surrendered to them, because everyone's being very nasty to each other. Well, did the U.S. offer the Japanese peace treaty negotiation, or was it unconditional? It was unconditional surrender. Um, and that also, it drove everybody on the Axis side to fight harder. I think it Tehran or the Casablanca conference, whichever one it was, I forget, that at least the Western powers, and I think the Soviets were also there, basically came and said, we're only accepting unconditional surrender. So that makes the Germans fight harder, longer. It doesn't really make the Italians fight longer, harder. They were willing to surrender unconditionally. Because, look at the Italians. They had lots of Italians living in America, and lots of Italians born in America. And there was a lot, warmer relations between America and Italy before the war. And hey, in the last big war, Italy was an ally of the West. So they sort of knew that, hey, if we lost, well, things are changed, but life will get on and life will be okay. Germany, unconditional surrender. And of course, it made the Nazis, knowing that they weren't going to survive as a government, and maybe not, depending on who they were, survive as people, especially if they look in the East and who was going to be occupying them, because again, if you're surrendering in, I don't know, 1943, before D-Day, and you're unconditionally surrendering, who's more likely occupying Germany, Britain and America in 1943? Britain and America, or the Soviet Union? Yeah, Soviet Union, for the Nazis, it might not be survivable. And so Germany definitely fights on longer and harder. Japan wants a negotiated surrender. They vehemently thought, okay, again, this is turning out to be a history lesson episode and not a game-playing one, which I'll have to label it as such. Japan has only fought one war with Western powers, and that's the Russo-Japanese War. Basically, it was, Port Arthur down here was a Russian possession. The Russians were pushing into this region, not necessarily against the Japanese, but just pushing into this region. Japan is worried about a European power being so close. It's different than, a little Shanghai enclave. No, Shanghai is up here. Shanghai enclave, or a Hong Kong and whatnot. It's a little different than that. It's pushing in. It's different than a colony. It was pushing in, and it wants to push into the region as well. It's a Japanese surprise attack, I believe, against the Russian fleet up here in Vladivostok, but maybe it was Port Arthur. God, I don't remember. When I start talking about these things, I don't have notes or anything in front of me. But it's one of the places, a Japanese surprise attack against the Navy, which doesn't, if I remember correctly, doesn't go so well. And so this becomes sort of trench warfare going on. Japanese versus the Russians. It actually, in a lot of ways, presages what is going to happen in Western Europe in the trench warfare. And neither party is able to get to winning situation. Japan, whose primary ally is Britain at the time, just can't quite defeat the Russians. The Russians are on the defensive, though, basically, is in all places. They're on the defensive. Russia and Drakchinifel, very good YouTube channel, had a great two-part episodes in his channel of the Russian fleet sailing all the way around the world up to Japan. So the main high seas, it's great. And he says the most remarkable thing is that the Russians actually made it there. talked about stuff. Lots of crazy stuff went on during that operation, but yeah. And so the Russians come in the Straits of Tsushima, which is sort of right here. Don't know specifically because there's Tsushima Island, which side or whatever. The Russian fleet's coming out here. Japan sinks the Russian high seas fleet, and that basically means the end of the war, because now Russia can no longer do anything. It is on the defensive. Japan is unable to push things to a victorious conclusion, because in a way, unless you, and the Russians were good enough, unless you somehow outmaneuver and trap and destroy their armies, they can always continue to sort of withdraw, And remember, they don't have Manchukuo or anything at the time. I think they had Korea, but they don't have, any of this territory here. So the Russians can keep withdrawing back up their supply lines. And so, and their goal was to, get sort of Port Arthur out here and sort of, back off Russia, back off, Asia's ours kind of thing. Don't come and mess in our area. That was their war goals. So Teddy Roosevelt, actually, who got a Nobel Peace Prize, gets the Japanese and the Russians to negotiate an end of the war. Okay, that's Japan's experience with imperial powers. Japan, particularly the Japanese naval settings, but Japan rather likes America. They did and they do. But the Japanese Navy liked America. The Japanese Navy is based on, naval thought is based on an American naval historian and strategist, Alfred Thayer Mahan. They're a Mahanian Navy. They like America. They plan to go to war with America because, not because they don't like America, but because there's no one else that's going to challenge them. They know the British. Well, if the British go to war with us, we're fine. We're good. Yeah, British has the biggest fleet in the world, but yeah, it's all over the world. It's not here. The French, yeah, no problem. The Russians, we've already defeated them. And then, of course, World War I breaks out, and they disappear, and they're now the Soviets, and they're their own thing. And they're worried about the Soviets, but not worried about the Soviet Navy. And so the French, the Germans, they don't have a navy anymore. Italy, the Italian Navy can't get out of the goddamn Mediterranean in any way, shape, or form of a significant element. And I mean that literally. They cannot get out of the Mediterranean because they don't have the legs, the ability to sail their ships and get outside of Japan without help. I mean, if Britain will allow them to, feed off of, Hong Kong and Singapore and whatnot and support Italian actions, they could maybe get the ships there, but they have no ability to operate in the Pacific Ocean. Without British permission, they can't freaking get out of the Mediterranean anyways, but whether they just sort of sail out anyways, it's not a worry. And Britain's not really much of a worry. It's America is potentially the worry. So they plan, nations plan to fight the biggest potential threats. So they were planning to fight the Americans because they liked America, but America owned the Philippines, America owned Guam, America owned Hawaii. Well, we might come into conflict one day, and who are we most worried about? It's America, if we come into conflict. So the Japanese Navy truly believed that someday there was going to be a war with America. Now, what the Japanese, again, viewpoint was partially based off their Russian experience, was that, I don't know, they were going to have a conflict somewhere. Some Japanese were going to shoot at some Americans, and we're going to be at war with each other. And so, America will sail its fleet out here, and there'll be a big battle. And the Japanese, of course, were hoping to sink the American fleet. But whoever won, and this is all going to negotiations, whoever won that big sea battle, whoever's going to sink the other enemy's fleet, they're going to win the war, and we'll negotiate what the settlement's going to be. does Japan get the Philippines, or does America get Formosa or something? They were going to, negotiate a surrender treaty, and okay, it was going to be settled. It's sort of like, two brothers fighting, or two, childhood friends, in their years have a fight over something, and then figure out who wins, and then get back to being brothers or friends or whatever. That's how they viewed what was going to happen. Well, they really pissed off America and found out, oh shit, America isn't going to negotiate a peace. We either have to surrender, something that Japan has never done, and it's not just because Japanese have surrendered to each other. The daimyos, before you get the shogun, they were fighting each other for suppression. But the emperor, sometimes in control, sometimes just a figurehead living off in Kyoto or wherever. But Japan itself has never surrendered. There was 2 Mongol invasions. And the Americans showing up with Perry's fleet wasn't really a surrender. It was more like, oh shit, you mean that's what the world's like outside? We got to update. But so they've never surrendered. They weren't culturally, emotionally, however you want to say it, ready for surrender. And so they fought on to the bitter end, until 2 nukes showed them that, yeah, if you don't surrender, you're done. Because America wasn't going to stop until there was total surrender by Japan. And America wasn't going to, it was total war. It wasn't just war against other soldiers. They were going to, obliterate Japan. Now, they only had 2 atomic bombs, but Japan doesn't know this. But they've already had firestorms, and they picked Hiroshima and Nagasaki as Hiroshima, and this is Nagasaki down here, as their targets, because those were 2 cities, major cities at the time, that had yet to be bombed, because they wanted to show what one bomb could do to an unbombed city. There were other cities. There was like 4 or 5 major cities that were on the target list, but these were the first 2. And already the Tokyo bombings were bad. They were specifically in Tokyo, trying to avoid the Imperial Palace at the time of Tokyo. They were also trying to sort of avoid the sort of Osaka, Kyoto type areas too, because they're sort of imperial cultural heritage. But they were bombing industrial cities like mad, especially down here in Yokohama. But they were going to bomb everywhere eventually, and Japan just realizes, yeah, there is either true and total defeat or there's surrender. There isn't going to be a secondary option. So they surrender. So that's sort of Japanese cultural experience. And I think we're going to need to end this episode, not the live stream, just this episode here, as on my views on Japan and World War II. And Japan gets ugly. Japan trying to choose my words correctly. Japan does a lot of biological and chemical warfare testing. Japan just gets really, really ugly even before the major war starts. And they don't have, to the best of my knowledge, the sort of ideas of wiping out large populations just because they exist, like the Germans do with the Jews or the Slavs or whatever they want to wipe out. But their tactics are just as ugly as anything the SS were doing. They would use any measures, any mass killings that they felt they needed to do. So that's sort of, and what is... Okay, it's a bit weird. Simple peace treaty would stop the war easy, and first in Japan might end. But U.S. acting No, they didn't. No, I would disagree with that. If you're leaving lawless, have a good day. Glad to have you here. Um, no, it you have to understand. America was not boneheaded in its opinion because Japan. Um, how do I put this? Um, Japan wasn't going to allow the regime of Tojo and the generals and whatever to stay in power. It would be like allowing the Nazis, like, oh, okay, yeah. Hitler, you get to stay in power. You get to still do what you're going to do with the Jews, and you get to keep Poland because, yeah, you get to keep Poland, but you'll have to leave France. No, Japan wasn't going to give up Korea, wasn't going to give up Formosa, really. It wasn't planning on giving up some of its puppets. It wasn't a question, Japan wasn't and never came up and said, oh, okay, you sunk our fleet at Midway. We'll negotiate a peace treaty with you. They never offered that. Okay, Japan doesn't even tell the army for about a month, or maybe longer, that they even lose at Midway. I mean, they don't even tell the army that all their carriers get sunk. The army doesn't know this. They know that there was a battle and the Japanese didn't win, but they didn't quite tell how bad it was. No, this wasn't a case of Japan offering, here, we'll do a peace treaty and surrender. No, they weren't willing to negotiate a situation in which their leaders had to surrender themselves. And America wasn't going to allow Japanese versions of Nazis. And I'm saying it Japanese versions. They weren't Nazis, but they were these imperialists to do their big war and then just stay in power. It's sort of like, yeah, the fascist Grand Council deposes Mussolini and concludes a peace treaty with the Western Allies. But that doesn't mean the fascists get to stay in power in Italy. It doesn't mean that Italy is not occupied. And that's obviously why the war continues in Italy, Allies versus Germany there. And so that it isn't just a simple thing. Japan was not willing to, because one of the early, even before the unconditional surrender, they weren't willing to they weren't ever saying, well, we'll leave China and we'll leave the Philippines and we'll leave Indochina and we'll leave Singapore and we'll leave all of these places and just go back to Japan and we'll keep Korea and leave Manchuria out. We'll get out of all of that stuff and have a peace. There was never that sort of situation. It wasn't that way. Now, and you got to remember, it's well into 45 that major fighting was still going on with Japan. So 44, 45, America is not willing to set up a conditional situation in which the Japanese regime gets to stay in power. They want unconditional warfare. Maybe at 44, late 44, 45, the Japanese government might have been willing to negotiate a withdrawal entirely from China. No, I'm not saying Korea even mentally, but from China, but stay in military power. And America just wasn't going to put up with that. And no, Britain and France and Australia, no one else was willing to put up with that. The Philippines, you want to go ask the Philippines, does Tojo get to stay in power in Tokyo? No. That was a no thing. So it's not just that. It's more than that, and it's So what Japan was willing to negotiate, win or loss, for like the big fleet battle that never really happened never really happened. I mean, they tried to have a few, but it never really happened. It wasn't major war aims, shall we say. China was never on the table for Japan. Really, at least as best as I could tell. So it wasn't that. And so it's sort of like, are you willing to have peace with Hitler, but he gets to keep Poland? That's why he went to war. Why was America putting embargoes on Japan? It was because of what they were doing to China. Japan, at no time that I understand, was even contemplating, publicly stating, or even privately through diplomatic sources, that we're willing to withdraw entirely from China. They weren't willing to go there, and that would mean places like Port Arthur, Manchukuo. They nowhere was that on the table, and that was America was not looking for a war with Japan, but was going to, well, if you're going to be that bad of a neighbor in the world, invading and butchering China, and we like China, well, we're going to stop doing business with you. You don't get to do business with America. They weren't blockading it. They weren't forcing other nations to not trade with them. If the Soviets wanted to trade with Japan, well, America wasn't going to do anything about that. The Dutch didn't like what was going on, so they weren't trading with them. The British weren't trading with them. The French weren't trading with them because they were upset with them. And no one is obligated to trade with another. One nation is not obligated to trade with another nation. If China does not want to sell semiconductors to the United States, China doesn't have to. Okay. Now it may throw the world into chaos. And it's really stupid how much we've let China undercut domestic production in different places in the world so that they go out of business, so it becomes, if not a single source, at least the primary source for certain medicines and for certain things like semiconductors. Not the only source, because there is some in Japan and there is some in Taiwan, and Taiwan is its own country. Okay, YouTube, you can ban me now. It can throw the world into chaos and stop trading something if it wishes to. It's China's right to not trade with either one nation or not trade with any nation. And so that is not a cause for war. Invading somebody else, blockading somebody else, sinking somebody else's ships, that is a cause for war. That's different. So the United States was putting economic pressure on Japan in an attempt to change Japan's behavior. But it was only putting pressure based on itself. It was never, to the best of anything that I've ever read, and I've read a bunch, it was never a thing like, well, if you do business with Japan, we will stop doing business with you. Like Peru, actually, at the time, was doing for whatever, because there's basically sort of a Japanese colony in Peru, if you guys don't know. One of the Peruvian, I think it was in the 80s or the 90s, one of the Peruvian prime ministers or whatever was of Japanese descent. There is sort of a small, if you will, sort of like it was in America, not like it's carved out colony, but just sort of an immigration colony into Peru. And so they were doing a lot of trading between Peru and Japan before World War II. It was never any sort of like, well, if you trade with Japan, Peru, you don't get to trade with America. No, it was just American business, American whatever was not allowed to trade with Japan. And that's not why Japan attacks America. That's why Japan attacks here. and America's sitting, right here. It has some ships and some divisions sitting in the Philippines, and it's, their colony. So America is sitting in between them and their goal, and they figure America might get a little upset when we attack Britain and the Dutch, and so they might come into the war, and then, it could be a problem. So let's just deal with it first. So yeah, it was never that kind of thing. I would say Japan, definitely after like the Midway battle, they would have maybe, if America was willing to, okay, Japan, you can keep the Dutch East Indies, you can keep Singapore, you can keep fighting your war in Japan, but just give us back our Philippines and Guam, and then we'll be all good again. Yeah, they would have negotiated those terms. Or something like that. I think they would have. But America was not in the mood to let them keep fighting in China. That was never a situation, as I see it. And you've got somebody who knows it better, because I don't think TIK has done much looking at the Pacific War, but if he ever gets into better research and says I'm incorrect, fine. I'm open to better research than I've done, that's for sure. Well, thank you, everyone. I know we were closing out a while ago, but we will do so now. Thanks, everyone. See you next time for more Hearts of Iron.